Mila Petrova sat on a rusted bench outside the dragon's tower, clutching a torn stuffed rabbit. 7 years old, a tiny shadow in an oversized cream sweater, she was a ghost to the men in suits who stepped over her like she was part of the sidewalk. Nobody knew she was fluent in Russian. Her mother had left her the language, and a thin silver bracelet, before the fever took her last winter. Now, it was just Mila and the cold city, trying to find enough coins for a warm meal. So Mila sat, and she listened. She had seen the tower's owner only from a distance. Kang Tae-jun, 41 years old, 6'2", a man with charcoal black eyes and a dragon tattoo that climbed his neck like a warning. He was a predator who didn't believe in mercy, let alone a girl who barely reached his waist. His elite mercenaries spoke Russian when they wanted to hide their secrets. They thought the air in this city was deaf. But Mila understood. And at 5:45 p.m. on a freezing Monday, she heard 3 words that made her heart stop. Podarok pod Siden Yem. The gift is under the seat. She looked at the reinforced black sedan idling at the curb. She looked at the mercenaries smirking at their watches. And she realized the most powerful man in the city was walking into a coffin. They say the most dangerous man in the city was undone by a 3-foot-tall ghost. Kang Tae-jun was a porcelain king, a man of zero sentiment, absolute power, and a $100,000 security team that had just sold his life for a check. He thought he was untouchable. He was wrong. Smash that like button right now if you believe that even the smallest person can change the world. At 5:59 p.m., as Tae-jun reaches for a car door that is about to become his coffin, the only thing standing between the dragon and a ball of fire isn't a bodyguard. It's a 7-year-old girl named Mila, clutching a torn rabbit and a secret the mercenaries thought was buried in Russia. Drop a heart in the comments if you've ever been underestimated, and subscribe to Afro-Korean Mafia stories by Marvella to see how a ghost can shatter a king's reality. In 60 seconds, 3 Russian words are going to save a life, and change a soul forever. You don't want to miss a single second of this transformation. 5:30 p.m., 30 minutes before. Kang Tae-jun stood in his glass-walled sanctuary on the 50th floor, his reflection as sharp as the crease in his Italian suit. He was a man of zero sentiment. To Tae-jun, the world was a chessboard, and he was the only player who mattered. People were either assets or obstacles. Trust. Trust was a defect he'd cut out of his heart years ago. His luxury blackface watch ticked. 5:31 p.m. Precision was his religion. Every day, exit at 5:55. Enter the car at 6 o'clock. Predictability wasn't a risk, it was a display of absolute dominance. No one dared touch the dragon. His head of security, a man with a heavy frame and a hidden Russian accent, appeared in the doorway. "Sir, the perimeter is clear. The car is waiting." Tae-jun didn't turn around. He adjusted his matte black silk tie, his signet ring catching the light. "Is the shipment secured?" "Yes, sir. Everything is ready for the 6 p.m. departure." "Then get out. You're breathing my air." The guard's eyes flashed with a dark, hidden knowing, but he bowed and retreated. Tae-jun didn't notice the flicker of hatred. He didn't notice anything but the numbers on his screen. Outside, the world felt very different. Mila tucked her chin into her thick gray scarf. The wind bit at her pale ivory skin. "Please, sir. Just a few cents." The businessman she approached didn't even blink, his polished shoes nearly crushing her worn brown boots. She'd been sitting here since the sun began to dip. She had nothing in her pockets but a few copper coins and her mother's bracelet. Her stomach was a hollow ache, and her fingers were turning blue. She was used to being a ghost. 7 years old, platinum blonde, poor. People looked through her, never at her. But being a ghost meant you could haunt the conversations people thought were private. Like now. The mercenaries, the men supposed to be Taejun's shield, stood by the hotel fountain, lighting cigarettes. They spoke in the low, guttural tones of her mother's homeland. Mila froze. "The remote is set for 6:01, one said in Russian, leaning against the car Taejun entered every single day. "When the engine turns, the dragon becomes ash." The other laughed, a sound like gravel grinding together. "A beautiful gift for a man who thinks he's a god." Mila's blood turned to ice. She looked at her stuffed rabbit, then at the towering glass building. In less than 30 minutes, a man was going to die. And the only person who knew the truth was a 3'11" girl that the world had forgotten. The afternoon sun hit the glass of the Kong Tower at a punishing angle, turning the skyscraper into a pillar of blinding light that loomed over the city like a god. At its base, the air was different, heavy, pressurized, and silent. Pedestrians instinctively lowered their voices as they neared the black marbled entrance. This was the domain of Kong Taejun, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath in his presence. Taejun moved through the lobby with a slow, predatory grace that made his security team look like frantic children. Standing 6'2" in a midnight black Italian suit, he was a study in controlled violence. His light olive skin was as smooth as expensive porcelain, yet the faint, jagged scars along his knuckles told the true story of how he had climbed to the top of the food chain. He didn't look at the people around him, he looked through them, his charcoal black eyes calculating the cost of everything they owned and the price of their loyalty. To Taejun, the world was a collection of tools to be used or obstacles to be crushed. Across the street, perched on a rusted iron bench that bit into her legs, Mila Petrova watched the dragon's lair. She was a silver-haired ghost in a world of steel. Her oversized cream sweater swallowed her narrow shoulders, and her platinum blonde braids were starting to fray, but her ice-blue eyes remained fixed on the tower's revolving doors. She clutched her stuffed rabbit to her chest, the worn fur a small comfort against the biting wind. Mila was used to the invisibility. To the businessmen in their tailored wool coats, she was just another part of the urban decay, a smudge of poverty on a pristine sidewalk. They didn't see the way her small fingers traced the Russian engraving on her mother's silver bracelet. They didn't notice that while they were busy checking their stocks, she was reading the faces of the men standing guard. Taejun stepped onto the sidewalk, a dark cashmere overcoat draped over his shoulders. The atmosphere curdled instantly. The dragon had emerged. He stood perfectly upright, his posture projecting an authority so absolute it felt like physical weight. A single strand of jet black hair fell over his brow, the only sign of imperfection on a man who demanded total precision. He was the porcelain king, untouchable and cold, heading toward a routine that had never failed him. From her bench, Mila saw him, the man everyone feared, and then she saw the guards. They weren't looking at the crowd for threats. They were looking at each other, their lips curling into smirks that didn't reach their eyes. They spoke in the low, rhythmic tongue of her mother's home, a language of snow and secrets. Mila leaned forward, her crystalline eyes widening. The king was walking, but the ghost was the only one who saw the trap waiting in the shadows. The luxury black-face watch on Taejun's wrist emitted a soft, mechanical click as the minute hand swept toward the 12. It was 5:45 p.m. Exactly 15 minutes remained before his world was scheduled to move. He stood on the edge of the curb, a statue of midnight silk and cold calculation, while his security chief, a man with a jaw like a vice, stepped closer to the idling sedan. Mila didn't move from her bench, but her breath hitched, catching in her gray knitted scarf. The mercenaries moved with a practiced, casual lethality, forming a loose perimeter that pushed the rest of the world away. Two of them leaned against the stone pillar of the fountain just feet from where Mila sat, their shadows stretching long and jagged over her worn boots. They didn't lower their voices. To them, the small girl clutching a stuffed rabbit was part of the masonry, deaf, dumb, and irrelevant. Then, the air shifted. The low, guttural roll of Russian syllables cut through the hum of city traffic. "The trigger is synchronized," one murmured, his hand resting near the holster hidden beneath his tactical jacket. One turn of the ignition, and the porcelain king shatters. He won't even have time to scream. The other man chuckled, the sound devoid of any warmth. "I checked the device myself. It's tucked right under the driver's seat. Pure craftsmanship. 5 kilos of C4 to send the dragon back to the dirt." Mila's ice-blue eyes widened, the crystalline depth of her gaze filling with a sudden, sharp terror. She knew that word, Potterrock. A gift. But the way they said it made her skin crawl. Her mother had once told her that words could be seeds or they could be bullets. These were bullets. They were laughing about a fire that hadn't started yet, counting down the seconds until the tall man in the black coat disappeared into a ball of flame. 15 minutes, the first guard said, checking his own watch. At 6 o'clock sharp, he gets in. At 6:01, we're rich men. They moved away then, their heavy boots echoing against the marble, leaving Mila alone in the cold. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at Taejun, who stood perfectly still, his charcoal black eyes fixed on the horizon as if he already owned the future. He had no idea that the ground beneath him was already poisoned. Mila gripped the thin silver bracelet on her wrist, the metal biting into her pale skin. She was only 7. She was 3'11". She was a ghost. But as the digital clock on the hotel tower flickered to 5:46, she realized that a ghost was the only thing standing between the porcelain king and his grave. The countdown had begun, and the silence of the city felt like a fuse burning toward the end. The digital numbers on the hotel's exterior clock flickered to 5:49 p.m. 11 minutes. The air felt like it was thickening, turning into a cold, invisible wall that separated Mila from the tall man in the black overcoat. She stood up from her bench, her legs trembling beneath her navy winter coat, and began to move. Every step toward the Kong Tower felt like wading through deep water, her worn brown boots clicking softly against the polished stone that everyone else walked upon with such careless confidence. She reached the massive revolving glass doors, her tiny reflection ghosting across the surface. Inside, the lobby was a cathedral of gold leaf and hushed voices. Mila slipped through the door, her oversized cream sweater a stark, pale blotch against the opulence. She headed straight for the concierge desk, a towering slab of black marble where a man in a crisp uniform stood like a sentry. "Please, sir," Mila whispered, her voice cracking. She reached up, her small fingers barely hooking over the edge of the marble. "The car. You have to tell the man with the dragon. It's a gift, a bad gift." The concierge didn't even look down at first. He was adjusting a stack of ivory envelopes, his movements precise and dismissive. When he finally noticed her, his lip curled in a way that made Mila feel smaller than she already was. "No soliciting, kid. We don't allow beggars in the lobby. Out." "I'm not begging," Mila insisted, her ice blue eyes wide and desperate. "The guards," they said. Before she could finish, a shadow fell over her. A hand, encased in a black leather glove, clamped down on her shoulder. The grip was heavy and cold, the fingers digging into her narrow collarbone with a cruelty that was casual, almost thoughtless. It was one of the regular hotel security guards, a man whose face was a mask of bored authority. "I set out," the guard grunted. He didn't lead her, he steered her, his massive frame looming over her like a collapsing building. To him, she wasn't a child with a warning, she was a nuisance to be cleared away before the porcelain king made his exit. Mila tried to dig her heels in, her stuffed rabbit slipping from her arm and falling to the plush carpet. "Wait! My rabbit! And the car, you don't understand." The guard kicked the toy aside with a polished boot and shoved Mila toward the revolving doors. "If I see you back in here, I'm calling the authorities. Go back to whatever hole you crawled out of." The glass doors spun, spitting her back out into the biting wind. Mila stumbled, her knees hitting the hard pavement. She looked up at the tower, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. At the curb, the black sedan sat waiting, its engine silent, its secrets tucked deep beneath the seat. She looked at her hands, shaking and small, and then at the clock. 5:52 p.m. 8 minutes left. The adults had failed her. The barrier was real, and it was made of more than just glass and stone, it was made of their refusal to see her. If she was going to save the dragon, she would have to be more than a ghost. She would have to be a storm. The sidewalk was a river of cold indifference, but Mila remained anchored to the concrete. She knelt there for a moment, the sting in her knees forgotten as she looked at the silver bracelet circling her thin wrist. In the dimming light, the Cyrillic engraving seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It was more than jewelry, it was a fragment of a woman who had once stood against the world with nothing but a steady voice and a fierce heart. "Never let them make you small, my little silver one," her mother had whispered, back when the world was warm. Mila reached out and snatched her stuffed rabbit from where the guard had kicked it, brushing the street grit from its matted fur. Her hands were no longer shaking. A strange, quiet clarity had settled over her, the kind of stillness that precedes a landslide. She looked at the hotel entrance, then at the black car that sat like a crouched predator at the curb. The mercenaries were still there, leaning against the stone pillars, their eyes scanning the horizon for rivals, completely blind to the threat standing 3 feet away. 5:54 p.m. 6 minutes. The invisible barrier hadn't broken, but Mila realized she didn't need to break it, she just had to ignore it. The porcelain king was about to walk out into a trap, and if the adults refused to hear her, she would force them to look at her. She wasn't just a street kid, and she wasn't just a ghost. She was the daughter of a woman who had survived the frozen winters of Moscow, and she carried the language of the men who were trying to kill him. She didn't run away. Instead, she moved toward the exact spot where the car door would open. She ignored the glares from the uniformed doormen and the heavy presence of the guards. She stood her ground, her tiny frame positioned directly in the dragon's path. Every instinct told her to hide, to go back to her grandmother and stay safe in the shadows, but the silver on her wrist felt hot against her skin. "I am Mila Petrova," she whispered to herself, her ice-blue eyes narrowing with a determination that looked ancient on such a young face. "And I am not invisible." She clutched the rabbit to her chest, her small shoulders squaring under the weight of the oversized sweater. She wouldn't be shoved aside again. She would wait until the porcelain king looked down, and she would use the only weapon she had, a language they thought was their secret, and a truth they thought was buried. The countdown was in its final minutes, and for the first time in her life, the little girl was more dangerous than the men with the guns. The clock on the hotel tower flickered to 5:59 p.m., and the world seemed to freeze into a frame of jagged glass. The massive revolving doors began to turn, and Kang Tae-jun stepped out. He was a pillar of shadow against the golden light of the lobby, his dark cashmere overcoat draped over his broad shoulders like a shroud. The air around him didn't just feel cold, it felt pressurized, a vacuum of power that sucked the breath out of everyone on the sidewalk. Conversations died. Pedestrians stepped back. The porcelain king was moving, and he did not move for anyone. Mila felt the vibration of his footsteps through the soles of her worn boots. He walked with a slow, deliberate cadence, his charcoal black eyes fixed on the sedan as if he were already mentally miles away. His security chief, the man who had laughed about the C4, stepped forward to pull the heavy car door open. The metal groaned, a sound like a funeral bell. "Sir, your schedule is clear for the evening," the traitor said, his voice a mask of perfect, lethal professionalism. Tae-jun didn't answer. He reached out a black-gloved hand, his fingers inches from the frame of the door, inches from the spark that would turn the street into an inferno. In that heartbeat, Mila moved. She didn't slip through the crowd this time, she cut through it like a blade. She ignored the shout of the doorman and the lunging arm of a mercenary. She ducked under the heavy velvet rope and threw herself directly into the narrow space between the Mafia boss and his waiting grave. Tae-jun stopped. It wasn't a flinch, it was a sudden, absolute cessation of motion, like a predator sensing a tripwire. He looked down. For the first time in his life, the most dangerous man in the city was forced to focus on someone who didn't exist in his world. Mila stood her ground, her tiny frame trembling but her head held high. Her platinum blonde braids had come loose in the wind, framing a face of pale ivory and desperate, crystalline intent. Their eyes met, a collision of ice blue and charcoal black. In his gaze, she saw a void of calculation and ancient cold. In hers, he saw a reflection of a truth he hadn't encountered in a decade. The air between them turned to literal ice, a 60-second vacuum where the sounds of the city, the sirens, the engines, the wind, simply vanished. He didn't speak. He didn't push her aside. He watched her, his sculpted features as unreadable as a stone monument, waiting for the ghost to find its voice. Mila clutched her rabbit so hard her knuckles turned white, her small chest heaving as she prepared to shatter the Porcelain King's reality with the only gift she had left. The silence that followed was more than the absence of sound, it was a physical weight, a cold vacuum where the breathing of the city seemed to stop. Taejun stood perfectly still, his charcoal black eyes narrowed, looking down at the small girl who had dared to touch the hem of his world. His security chief moved forward, his face a mask of irritated professional concern, reaching out to snag Mila's arm and toss her back into the gutter. "Step back, kid," the man growled in English, his fingers closing in. "The chairman is on a schedule." Mila didn't flinch. She didn't look at the mercenary. She looked only at Taejun, at the high, sculpted cheekbones and the single rebellious strand of jet black hair that fell near his temple. She took a breath that tasted of snow and gasoline, and she spoke. The words didn't come from a 7-year-old beggar, they came from the silver-haired ghost of a woman who had taught her daughter that truth was the only shield that never broke. Podarok pod Sidon Yem. The air didn't just turn to ice, it shattered. Taejun's hand, which had been hovering an inch from the car door, jerked back as if the metal had turned into white-hot iron. He didn't look at the car. He looked at Mila. His expression, usually an unreadable porcelain mask, flickered with a predatory sharp-edged shock. "The gift is under the seat." The security chief froze, his hand stopping mid-air. The other guards, the ones who had been smirking by the fountain, went pale, their eyes darting toward each other in a frantic, silent calculation. They had spoken a language they thought was a dead secret in this city. They had built their entire betrayal on the arrogance that no one, least of all a child clutching a torn rabbit, could decode their execution order. Taejun turned his head slowly toward his security chief. The red shadow beneath his pupils began to glow, a sign of the dragon waking up. "Victor," he said, his voice a low, lethal vibration that made the men around him lose their nerve. "I didn't know you recruited from Moscow. Or perhaps, you simply forgot that I value transparency." Victor's jaw tightened. He reached for his jacket, his hand moving toward a weapon, but the moment had already been stolen from him. The invisible barrier hadn't just been bypassed, it had been incinerated. Taejun stepped away from the vehicle, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator that had just seen the snare. He looked at the sleek black sedan, then back at the tiny girl with the crystalline blue eyes. He realized in that heartbeat that his entire empire of steel and gold had almost been erased, and the only reason he was still breathing was a child who spoke a language his loyal dogs thought she was too small to understand. The silence on the street was absolute, broken only by the ticking of a bomb that no longer had a victim. The explosion didn't come from the car, but from the sudden, violent shift in the atmosphere. Victor's hand had barely grazed the grip of his pistol before Taejun's movement blurred, a heavy, black-gloved fist connecting with the traitor's jaw with the force of a falling mountain. The sound of bone meeting leather echoed off the marble walls, followed immediately by the sharp, rhythmic clicks of a dozen different weapons being drawn. But these weren't Victor's men. From the shadows of the lobby and the secondary vehicles, Taejun's true loyalists, the ones he kept as a shadow cabinet for exactly this kind of rot, swarmed the sidewalk. The Russian mercenaries were tackled into the stone, their faces pressed into the cold grit of the pavement they had stood upon so arrogantly moments ago. "Check the car," Taejun commanded, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. A specialist from the backup team knelt by the driver's side, sliding a fiber-optic camera beneath the chassis. A moment later, the man looked up, his face drained of color. "She was right, sir. Pressure-sensitive plate wired to the ignition. If you'd sat down, the block would be gone." Taejun didn't look at the bomb. He didn't look at Victor, who was being dragged away, blood staining his white dress shirt. Instead, he turned toward Mila. She was still standing where the world had frozen, her small chest heaving, her platinum blonde braids whipped by the wind. She looked fragile, a tiny ivory bird amidst a circle of wolves and steel, yet she was the only thing in the city that hadn't broken under his gaze. The porcelain king felt a crack in his chest, not of weakness, but of a terrifying, new awareness. He had spent 41 years building an empire out of zero sentiment, convinced that power was a math equation solved with fear. He had walked past this child for months, categorizing her as invisible, as nothing. And yet, his high-priced security had sold him for a check, while this girl, who had every reason to hate the man who ignored her, had stepped into the line of fire for nothing more than the weight of 3 Russian words. His controlled world, a masterpiece of precision and coldness, lay in ruins around his feet, far more destroyed than the car would have been. He realized that his strength was a hollow shell. He had been a king of shadows, while this 7-year-old with a torn rabbit was the only one who actually possessed the light. Taejun knelt. It was a slow, deliberate movement that sent a shockwave through his remaining guards. The dragon, who never bowed, was at eye level with a street kid. He looked into her crystalline blue eyes and saw not fear, but a weary, crystalline courage. "Mila," he said, his voice stripped of its usual iron. He didn't know how he knew her name, perhaps he had seen it on her backpack, or perhaps, for the first time, he was finally truly seeing. "You saved a man who didn't deserve it." Mila reached out, her small hand hovering near his expensive cashmere sleeve. "I just didn't want the fire to happen," she whispered. Taejun reached out, his black-gloved hand gently steadying her trembling shoulder. The invisible girl had just become the center of his universe, and the dragon knew that from this moment on, the fire she had stopped would be nothing compared to the one he would burn for her protection. The elevator in Mila's tenement building groaned, a rusted iron cage that smelled of damp concrete and forgotten dreams. Kang Taejun stood inside, his 6 feet 2 inches frame making the cramped space feel like a coffin. He was still wearing the tailored Italian suit, the heavy gold chain cold against his collarbone, but the porcelain king felt dangerously out of place. He reached the 4th floor and stepped into a hallway where the light bulbs flickered with a dying rhythm. He stopped at door 4B. He didn't knock with the aggressive authority of a mob boss. He hesitated, his black-gloved hand hovering over the peeling wood. When the door opened, the smell of cheap tea and old wool drifted out. The apartment was a skeletal remains of a life. It was a single room, the walls thin enough to hear the city screaming outside. There was no heating, only a small electric coil that hummed weakly in the corner. Mila sat on a mattress that sat directly on the floor, her oversized cream sweater pulled over her knees, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Her grandmother stood by the sink, her eyes widening with a terror that Taejun was intimately familiar with, the look of a person who knew that men like him only brought storm clouds. Taejun didn't speak immediately. He looked at the window, which was cracked and stuffed with old newspapers to keep out the March frost. He looked at the single plate on the table, holding a piece of dry bread. In his high-rise sanctuary, he had spent a decade building walls of glass and steel, convinced that isolation was the only way to stay powerful. He had surrounded himself with precision and calculated risks, thinking he was a god because he could look down on the ants below. But looking at Mila now, he realized he had been the one living in a hollow shell. He had been building walls to hide his fear, while this 7-year-old had been building an empire of courage out of nothing but a silver bracelet and a memory of her mother. "I spent my life thinking vulnerability was a defect," Taejun said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate the thin walls. He didn't look at the grandmother, he looked at Mila. "I thought I was the one who was strong." He reached into his overcoat and pulled out a heavy signet ring, the symbol of his organization. He set it on the scarred wooden table, but he didn't leave it there as a threat. He pushed it aside to make room for a simple, leather-bound folder. "The Dragon's Tower is a fortress of lies," he whispered, his charcoal black eyes softening for the first time in 10 years. "But you are the only truth I've found in this city." He realized then that he didn't want to go back to his glass office. He wanted to burn the old empire down and build something that deserved a girl like Mila. He had come to repay a debt, but as he looked at her crystalline blue eyes, he knew he would be spending the rest of his life trying to learn the bravery she practiced every single day. The auditorium was a cathedral of hushed anticipation, the air smelling of floor wax and expensive perfumes. Kang Taejun sat in the front row, his powerful frame filling the velvet seat with a presence that still commanded the room, though the invisible pressure he once radiated had mellowed into something deeper, a quiet, grounded strength. His jet-black hair was still slicked back with precision, though a few silver strands now caught the light at his temples, and the dragon tattoo on his neck was partially obscured by the collar of a soft charcoal sweater. He no longer wore the black leather gloves of a predator, his hands, once scarred by a violent past, rested openly on his knees, steady and calm. Beside him, Mila's grandmother wore a silk shawl, her eyes bright with happy tears. They weren't looking at a spreadsheet or a city skyline from a penthouse window. They were looking at the stage. "And now," the headmaster announced, his voice echoing with genuine respect, "to present the inaugural Petrova Excellence Award, please welcome Mila Petrova." The girl who stepped into the spotlight was no longer the 3'11" ghost, in a worn wool sweater. Now 14, Mila moved with a grace that was both delicate and fierce. Her platinum blonde hair fell in soft waves over a navy blazer, and the thin silver bracelet on her wrist glinted under the stage lights. But it was her eyes, those crystalline ice-blue eyes, that held the room captive. They still carried that strange mix of innocence and courage, the look of someone who understood the world's darkness but chose to speak light into it anyway. Taejun felt a familiar crack in his chest, the one that had started years ago on a cold sidewalk. He remembered the 5:59 p.m. deadline, the smell of gasoline, and the 3 Russian words that had shattered his porcelain heart. He had spent a decade thinking power was built with walls and silence, but Mila had taught him that the greatest empire was the one built on being heard. He had restructured his world in her image. The dragon had traded his shadow empire for a legacy of protection, funding schools, building community centers, and ensuring that no child in the city ever felt invisible again. He had realized that he hadn't just saved a girl, he had been rescued by one. As Mila began to speak, her voice steady and fearless, Taejun leaned back and closed his eyes for a brief second. He was no longer just a mafia boss, he was a guardian, a witness to a miracle. He finally understood that while he had been looking for strength in the roar of the crowd and the weight of gold, the biggest truths had always been carried by the smallest voices. Mila finished her speech and looked directly at him, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. Taejun didn't just watch her, he saw her. And for the first time in his life, the Porcelain King felt truly, vibrantly alive. A year ago, Kang Taejun would have walked past Mila Petrova without even seeing a person. Today, he's at her school meetings. It took a 7-year-old street kid to teach a mafia boss that true power isn't found in walls or weapons, it's found in the courage to speak up when everyone else stays silent. Taejun didn't just rebuild his security, he rebuilt his heart. He realized that while he was building an empire, he was actually living in a cage, and it took a ghost to show him the door. What was your favorite moment? Was it Mila grabbing the dragon's sleeve, or the look on the traitors' faces when they realized the little girl understood every word? Comment below. If this story reminded you that no one is too small to make a difference, smash that like button and subscribe to Korean Mafia Tales. Sometimes the world's biggest truths are carried by the voices we ignore the most. See you in the next story.